There is either an answer or there is no answer. There cannot be 100 solutions nor even two, not in the fundamental sense. If we are dumbfounded regarding origins, how much more dumbfounded are we by many independent origin stories? If we do not understand how life evolved or arose, then how more absurd is the idea that matter, animals, and man all had independent, uncorrelated sources. Evolutionary theory is not a clever theory so much as a theory of absolute necessity. Once one has rejected God, everything had to come from somewhere, in the singular. Yet, the evidence points to an independent origin of kinds, that is, types of life. However, we know that this cannot be so because we know all life has to have the same source. Many people think they sacrifice scientific integrity by resorting to the claim that God did it. However, the interesting thing is, we are presented with two options: either things arose naturally, that is by means of what already exists, or there are transcendent forces at work. But think of the logic of this. The existence of God might appear to speak of the supernatural, but what does it mean to say all existence rose by natural forces, when there were no forces, natural or otherwise, prior to the emergence of reality? Some think they can escape the absurdity of nothing bringing about everything by saying reality is eternal. The proposition that reality is eternal opens the door to an eternally existing being. But there is nothing in nature that suggests it is eternal, and so we would have to posit other realities that for some reason ended up giving us this reality. The more we try to give detail to this conception of things, the more it becomes obvious we are trying to bring in God without mentioning God. But let's leave this discussion on the complexity introduced simply by utilizing some other causative principle than God and look at the benefits of positing, God exists. God exists is the great hypothesis. It is great, meaning highly significant, because if we posit, God exists, a path to the resolution of all known problems is revealed. This is important to note, because all problems must have a single source solution if we are condemned to dealing with multiple origin events. Unless we admit to a single source for all problems, we simply multiply the sources of our problems, without finding a solution. The reader may not like this argument, but if there is no God, then, as we have pointed out, no plausible emergence of reality is possible. It will also be demonstrated there are no solutions without the great hypothesis being made. First of all, we must establish what the great hypothesis means. It is apparent that those who deny God are actually rejecting God as God. One of the best-known examples of this is the Epicurean paradox that declared the presence of evil means God is evil or important or does not exist. But this is not God, because if God is evil or impotent, he is not God. God is the highest and most perfect of all possible conceptions. If we speak of something critically, it is not God. The very act of saying something is imperfect is to demonstrate one is not talking about God. You may wish to say God is neither moral nor perfect, but that is because what you conceive of is other than God. This is not a philosophical problem nor even a theological one, it is a moral and logical issue. If we reject the God hypothesis, we lose the ability to create a moral worldview. The person without God is a legalist and a naturalist. There are only two realities, and one is under God and the other is under Satan. These two realities make for two separate peoples. But because of sin we are all born into the satanic world of the flesh. We need to die to this reality before being reborn into the reality created for us by God. The central feature of this reality is the church. The church is the modern equivalent of the tribe. Christians are tribal. But without the God hypothesis the path to this reality does not exist. One is left with blind guides to lead the blind. This is tantamount to saying there are no alternative choices, no alternative pathways out, once one has rejected the God hypothesis. Without God, what are we left with? God is what we humans call aspirational. He is a perfect being and something to aspire to. Without God, what perfection is there? What do we aspire to? What is left to motivate us if there is no God? These are not questions atheists ask, though they ought to. Let us assume there is no God. If not, then there is no authority with absolute power. In this group of non-believers we must include all ethicists, those who believe all power is enshrined in law. That is, the control group who in one way or another live as the law requires them to live. Life in this view is an experiment, a test conducted with two groups. These groups correspond to the two races that inhabit the two realities. One reality is legalist and ethical and the other is moral and Christian. Another way of distinguishing the two groups is by means of the concepts, tribal and hierarchical. The moral group is organized by means of the market. This is just another way of saying the test group operates by means of the tribal ministry, what used to be called the tribal totem or tribal identity. In the church our ministry is the way we feed the sheep, it is the way we care for the tribal members. The believers in God divide up into tribes to serve God and through faith and works of faith become perfected in their service to each other and in their exhibiting the persona of the church. But this common vision is not available to non-believers. Even if they share some features, identitarians lack faith in each other. There is always a degree of distrust because they are never on the same path. Blacks are identitarians and share an identity given to them by their skin color, but as we know, they also have other allegiances that have little or nothing to do with skin tone. Even Islam, which brings their members together under the umbrella of striving for the global caliphate, has internal rifts. At this point many will point out that Christianity is composed of many denominations and rogue elements. This is true, but these divisions have limited expression. They cannot deny Jesus without stepping beyond the limits of Christianity. Once Christ is acknowledged as God, there are limits on how disparate one's expression of faith can be. Thus, all churches share the same confession of faith. We all baptize our members and we all profess that Christ is Lord. Even if we disagree as Christians, the intent is to modify what we all aim for, a closer walk in faith with Christ. So, the destination remains the same regardless of what the details of our journey are. More crucially, the different churches lack any official means to obstruct the work of other churches. Our authority is entirely theological. Our power comes totally through our apologetic. Churches cannot and do not resort to law because if they do, they remove themselves into a different reality. But conversely, no identitarian can force others to share their identity. Those who live under the law cannot posit a common end applicable to all persons. The energies of non-believers is expended in gaining an advantage in the here and now. Even a common position such as an injunction against murder becomes complicated over time as more and more qualifications are introduced. But who gets to decide what murder is or what factors modify the seriousness of the crime? Who moderates the discussion? Whose views ought to prevail? A non-Christian may claim he or she believes in God, but invariably they are faced with the same questions and issues that plague an atheist. Who has the final authority? Whose opinion gets to become the law of the land? There is only one response to these issues and that is brute force. Non-Christians live according to the law of the jungle, and they cannot escape this. They can modify it, they can ameliorate it, but regardless of how civilized the system may appear to be, underlying all of the law and traditions is a club and the threat that it will be used. No law is effective if it does not have an enforcement option. Even in the most law-abiding society, there is always the potential for force to be used, if and when required. The law of the jungle is contained in a well-known aphorism, might makes right and the end justifies the means. Every state and every street gang subscribes to this doctrine, the doctrine of power. No nation that does not hold this to be self-evident, will endure. Without God all we have left is the club, and then, the only means the non-believer has when deciding whose opinion matters, is resorting to violence and seeing which group can destroy the most that the other group has, the fastest. We can sublimate this ultimate test through the use of democracy and other means, but in the end, when people cannot be convinced to stand down and accept the rule of someone they do not agree with, the gloves must come off and the law of the jungle must prevail. Indeed, the only reason why there is peace, is because those who oppose the rule of those in charge, are too frightened of the power able to be exerted by the authorities, to oppose them.